I wrote a book called Widowland a few books ago, and it had some Nazis in it. And the American edition had sensitivity readers, and they rang up and they said, "Well, we have found some problems." And I said, "Oh, what?" And they said, "Well, we found some instances where negative personality characteristics are correlated with bodily size." I said, "What?"
Yes, you heard that right. Some strange people don't want fat Nazis, so the likes of Hermann Goering can breathe a sigh of relief from the grave, or hell as is more likely. Today's bonus episode is an absolute treat with three authors, one fiction, one non-fiction, and one who does both, Jane Thynne, Paul Lay and Miranda Malins. We talk sensitivity readers, as you heard at the top there, accusations of making things up from prominent historians, as well as the balancing act to make characters believable, our favourite fiction authors, and finally, which actors portray the past best. This is all in honour of the Buckingham History Festival, where the three authors you hear today, as well as Elizabeth Buchan, author of Bonjour Sophie, will be on the panel event discussing fiction and much more. Plenty more great history to come is on the way, so please do subscribe, and if you can bear to, a favourable review on Spotify or Apple would be fantastic. But in the meantime, it's Jane, Paul, Miranda and me talking historical fiction. It gives me great pleasure to welcome Jane Thynne, Miranda Malins, and Paul Lay to this chat, which is going to be very informal for listeners. And so this chat is going to be talking about the Buckingham History Festival, which, Paul, actually, we discussed this last year for last year's festival. And I do like the Buckingham History Festival, mainly because there are so many wonderful aspects of history authors in it. But also because of the high quality as well. That's the main reason. But Paul, I thought before we dive in with Jane and Miranda, and of course yourself, to talk about historical fiction, could you just give a sort of few highlights of what is going on at Buckingham this year?
Yeah, well, it's taking place on the weekend, going from Friday the 13th to Sunday the 15th of September. It's at Buckingham University in Buckingham in Hunter Street. Tickets are on sale now. The website's there. If you just Google Buckingham History Festival, and tickets are on sale, individual events for all day and 3 days. And we've got a mix of historians. Some will be extremely well known, the likes of Dan Jones and Richard Evans. Richard Evans is talking on the Nazis. Dan Jones is talking on Henry V. The Friday is quite devoted to a chronology of British history in some ways. So we've got Stephen Alford looking at Cecil. So we're talking about spies and intelligence during the Tudor period. And then Susan Doran, who's got a new book out on regime change between Tudors and Stuarts, follows that. Then we've got Alice Hunt on the Republic, Cromwell's protectorate, etc. And then Giles Milton is talking about Britain and the West's response to Soviet Union and Stalin. And then we've got lots of other stuff ranging from the classical world with Daisy Dunn looking at the role of women in the classical world. Jonathan Keats on Venice. We've got a lot of diverse range of stuff, but it's all quite scholarly. So I think it's fair to say the old cliche, but there's something for everyone. And it's a very friendly festival. It's very relaxed, and there's lots of engagement with the audience and the speakers. So it should be a very good weekend. And one of the things we're doing there is a panel, hence this podcast is a panel on historical fiction. The positive things and perhaps even negative things about historical fiction. We don't know. We're going to discuss that. But we've got some distinguished guests there, Oliver, as you well know, who are joining us here.
Indeed, indeed. Well, so just before we dive into that, I was having a conversation. You mentioned Daisy Dunn's new book, The Missing Thread, and I'm sure
Yeah.
we're all interested in that because it's key female figures of the ancient world. Did you know that Aspasia, the consort of Pericles, may well be the originator of Western thought? This is a revelation to me, having spoken to Armand Danjour, who's a classicist. And so Daisy's book, I'm sure, deals with that. And it'd be very interesting to hear about that. So a reason I mention it is that we just had Armand on. And so listeners hopefully will be familiar with that.
Well, Armand is terrific, actually, and has a terrific new podcast, which I was listening to last night on a particular favourite of mine. I've just been in correspondence with him this morning, which is Catullus, who is one of my favourite poets. I mean, down and dirty with Catullus. And of course, Daisy's written and translated. She's written on and translated the works of Catullus, which is hugely entertaining stuff, not necessarily for minors, I don't think, but it's very adult fare, but it's extremely amusing and extremely incisive and actually quite moving at times as well.
Minors, as in children, not people who go underground.
As in not adults, yes. It's very exotificate, some of it.
Great stuff. Well, let's get cracking with historical fiction then. So you mentioned the negative aspects. Why don't we just kick off with that? Now, I listened to, this is probably familiar to you guys. A number of years ago, there was a Radio 4 discussion, I think Start the Week or something like that. And Neil Ferguson was on there, the great historian, and a fiction author whose name has escaped me, which is slightly embarrassing. So please forgive me for that. But in it, Neil went in sort of studs up on historical fiction authors and said the sort of rather cruel phrase, they just make stuff up. Now, that is probably, for a very serious historian, historical fiction is sort of prone to this. So I thought maybe Jane, we could kick off with you, and then Miranda, it'd be very interesting to get your view because you've got your sort of feet in both pieces of territory, really. But Jane, what do you think about the accusation, the harsh accusation that you're just making stuff up?
Well, what is fiction? I mean, I have issues anyhow with the term historical fiction, which is usually or has for a long time been relatively pejorative. I mean, fiction is an attempt to inhabit the minds and lives of others, and it always has been. Tolstoy was indulging in historical fiction when he wrote War and Peace, which was not exactly contemporaneous with him. Fiction is, well, Auden said, the only way we can actually commune with the dead. It's a way of stretching your mind out over centuries or years to try and imagine what it's like to live with other people. I'm amazed actually that Neil Ferguson, who's such an intelligent and enlightened person, would say something like that. But I do think, and I was mentioning earlier, if you're writing about particular periods of fiction, so many of my novels have been set in occupied Europe during the 20th century, which is a time which not only has huge reverberations now, but also traumatic reverberations, and in some cases is still in living memory. I think fiction writers, novelists, do have a duty to take seriously dates, events, accuracy, in a way that maybe if you were writing about I'm going to be contentious here, but like Roman Britain, you might be more flexible with people and events. So I've always been really careful. I've written a lot about the wives of the Nazi leaders, and I really spent a lot of time doing documentary research on letters and their autobiographies to try and get things really relatively accurate. I think that actually, as we go on, historical fiction, which is now really just a marketing term, should be replaced by something different, or just call it fiction, which is what I think Hilary Mantel wanted us to do.
Right, I need to remove all references of historical fiction from the Aspects of History website now. A lot of work for me to do. So, Miranda, you're writing a history book at the moment and historical fiction, so you kind of see both sides, but keen to know what you think.
Yes, I do. I see both sides, often in a positive way. And I feel that writing history and fiction about the same period can be a positive experience because the two can cross-fertilize and improve each other. The fact that I have my sort of history background means that I think my novels are more well researched. But because I write novels as well, I think that has meant that my nonfiction writing is better, has a better sense of plot and pace, and is written better. At least I hope so. But I entirely agree about that point that historical fiction as a term is a little bit redundant because it's so all encompassing, and it covers everything from stories which are entirely made up, fantastic stories, but set in a slightly otherworldly, slightly past, dreamlike past place, right through to the kind of historical fiction that we've just said Hilary Mantel was doing, that I tried to do, which is all about real people. And the books that I write about the Cromwell family, I start the books with a timeline, a really detailed timeline of exactly who is where, what are they doing. I try never to have someone in the wrong place. I always make sure if Parliament's sitting or the Council of State is meeting, that was actually happening. So I do also feel that historians, shouldn't have a monopoly on the past. We shouldn't be the gatekeepers and say no one else can touch any of this stuff. It's great for other people to interpret it and play with it and turn it into different forms, whether that's fiction or music or poetry or art or whatever, however we want to interpret it. It's a way for all of us to connect to the past. And historical fiction in particular, I find, is often a gateway drug, that's how I see it, to the hard stuff of the non-fiction, especially for children and for teenagers. So we definitely want to be encouraging it.
I think we're coming both from the same point, the historians and historical fiction writers, which is that we want to access and understand the past. And I think probably what enrages a lot of very purely non-fiction writers is that it's damn hard going through all that documentation and making sure everything is triply accurate. And sometimes there must be a kind of huge irritation that somebody can just go, oh, I'll make it up. I mean, I used to feel this as a journalist, it must be so much easier just making it up. But at the same time, the impulse is the same, and you get a lot of what we all know and enjoy, huge numbers of historical fiction, non-fiction writers. I mean, say Ben McIntyre, who tell things like a story, and so they're using fictional techniques. I'm not saying these things are the same, but I'm saying that they share the same foundational impulse.
Yes, I absolutely agree with that. They're not the same, and also they're not marketed as the same. If someone who's picking up a historical novel is clear that it's a novel, and if they want to find out more of the history, or they want to work out what is true or what is not, often there's a historical note at the back pointing you to more research. And so many of our best historical novelists do phenomenal amounts of research beforehand. C.J. Sansom always did huge amounts of research for all of his Shardlake books. And in a sense, I was talking to Dan Jones about this last night, because he obviously writes history and now fiction. You're actually just drawing from the same research material, but you're showing the story in a different way. And I'm a firm believer that there's in almost finding the form that's going to suit your particular historical story. And in the case of my novels about Cromwell's daughters, for instance, I originally meant to write a history book about them. And then I decided that because the evidence is very patchy, and often, as with women in the past, so often they're just in the margins or in the footnotes what was going on, I'd write a really irritating history book, because the whole thing would say, well, we imagine Mrs. Cromwell missed her husband when he was away on campaign. Or, it would all be that little bit of extra reach all the time, which I thought would irritate. And then I thought, well, if I write about them in fiction, I can put absolutely everything we know about them in there, but just link it all together in a more compelling way, because it's in a more immediate way, because it's fiction. But another story would be better suited to history, to nonfiction.
It's interesting that we both write about the female experience, and indeed we were discussing Daisy Dunn, which when I kind of first wrote my Black Roses, which was my first book set in Nazi Germany, more than a decade ago, it was people were writing less about the female experience, and the frustration for us writing about the female experience is that people didn't. I mean, if you count the number, if I count the number of books I possess on Goering or kind of Hess or Goebbels, compared to the number of books you might possess on the wives of these people, and wives who were in many cases extremely influential on their husbands. It's interesting. So it's much harder for us as historians to research these things. We have to go to different primary sources to find out. And so fiction is a good method. But what the other thing I want to say about fiction is art. You know, if you think of, and God forbid one would never compare oneself in any way, but if you think of somebody like Shakespeare, who reached to the past for stories and interesting dramatic periods of the past, but what he was really doing was writing and creating a piece of art that made people reflect on themselves and their own existence, and to be transported. And so I don't ever accept that historical fiction is just a rough, lazy way of writing history. What it is first and foremost an attempt to create a living but fictional world that will transport you.
It's a different discipline, as you say, and requires different skills. You've got the same research base, but you know, again, thinking about writing about the same people, when you write about people as a historian, you've always got a level of detachment. You're at arm's length. And yes, obviously, if you're a good historian, you try to put yourself in their shoes, you try to emote, understand what's going on and what their motivation is. But you've always got that level of sort of detachment and omniscience almost. But as a novelist, I find when I write about people, you know, I have to imagine I'm absolutely living through the terrible event that's happening, the birth, the death. And I can find myself in floods of tears writing a death scene, for instance, which I never would be doing. I'd never find myself in floods of tears writing about a death in a work of nonfiction. So it does engage different parts of your brain and your emotions, I think.
Fiction is hard. It's an art, you know. It's not. It's a different thing, and I stand by that.
Paul, you've written a highly acclaimed non-fiction book. Have you ever been Providence Lost? I just get the plug in there for you. But have you ever been tempted to write some fiction?
Yes, I have, and maybe I will. I mean, I think it's a really interesting point Jade makes there about we tend to think, or a lot of people tend to think about historical fiction in the wake of Hilary Mantel's success with the Wolf Hall trilogy, which took off again. And of course, we've had periods where an historical novel just takes off popularly. I mean, I remember, 40 years ago or so, it was The Name of the Rose. So, but it has a very, very deep history, historical fiction, not the historical novel, because we can trace the novel itself only back to the 17th, 18th century. But in terms of historical fiction, we're going right back to, Sophocles, Aeschylus, they wrote historical fiction. And in many ways, I don't think that anyone in any realm of fiction, even Shakespeare, has surpassed Oedipus Rex as a plot and as a drama. I mean, it's simply unbeatable, and it's been improvised again and again and again. But I think when it comes to judging this stuff, and I suppose I think about this from editorial experience, is whether it's fiction or whether it's fact, or whether perhaps it's a mixture of the two. It's really just, is it good or is it not? Does it work? Does it not? Does it feel right, or is it incisive? Does it tell you the truth? And I think it's interesting that Neil Ferguson was a critic, because Neil is predominantly a historian of the 20th century, for which all the facts are known. And so you can say, to a certain extent, I can see why he thinks you shouldn't use your imagination, because, say, it's different to a classicist. We were talking about Armand earlier, but I've had this conversation with people like Daisy Dunn, Tom Holland, about how much liberty a classicist has, because the sources are by themselves fragmented. I mean, Armand is the perfect person for this, because he fills in so many gaps in terms of poetry and drama and letters going back to the Greeks, because they are by themselves just full of these gaps that he has to fill in with some information about what he knows about fact, but also with his imagination built upon his knowledge of that period. And I think actually that's, Miranda and I, being 17th century historians, we have the opposite problem, where there's almost too much information. You have this mad amount of publishing and pamphlets and speeches and correspondence. So it's essentially filtering that down. But it's all a kind of editing process, and then it becomes an act of imagination, with even when the sources are as complete as they are in the 20th century, one has to interpret that stuff, and one uses one's imagination, and nothing is complete. We're thinking about the motivations of people, we're thinking about how they implement their ideas, the difference between the implementation and what they actually wanted to do. So, there are always these gaps in history, whether we're writing so-called fact or fiction. We always have to plug those gaps with the imagination. And I think the other thing about historical fiction, why people like historical fiction, is because so many historians, straight historians, can't write very well. And so people want narrative history. And you see, narrative historians sell well, people who can tell a story, but so does historical fiction, because they're telling a story. And I think when you can certainly differ in terms of Hilary Mantel's model of Thomas Cromwell. I mean, I certainly would, but you can't deny the skill and the imagination and the conscientiousness of someone like that, and C.J. Sansom and people like that. They've done their work. And it's also worth saying that, going back to that deeper thing, the historical novel goes back a long, long way as well. I've been reading Thackeray.
Yeah, I was about to mention Vanity Fair. Yeah,
historical novelist. I mean, really, really good in things like Pendennis and Henry Esmond and stuff like that. I mean, really, really wonderful stuff, and very, very incisive and very knowledgeable, because he also wrote histories as well. And his great ambition was to write a biography of Queen Anne, which he never quite completed. But, people who write novels are historically informed. And I suppose in our own day, we've got people like Robert Harris, who sells in phenomenal numbers. But I don't think anyone can doubt that he does his research.
I was just thinking of Robert Harris, actually, because his new book, Precipice, is coming out, isn't it? And again, he's used a lot of primary sources, a lot of the actual words of the actual correspondence in there. But just thinking of Thomas Cromwell, for instance, what you just said, Paul, made me think of a story I've heard Professor Dermot McCulloch from Oxford University say, and he is a sort of foremost academic expert on Thomas Cromwell. And he tells the story that he picked up Wolf Hall, the first early copy of it in the bookshop, however many years ago it was, read it and felt totally astonished, because Hilary Mantel and he had both conjured up the same Cromwell. He was writing his Thomas Cromwell biography at the time, and they had both gone through the massive archive there is about Thomas Cromwell and come up with exactly the same conclusions about the man, which were very revisionist and were overturning a lot of what historians have thought in the past. And they'd both arrived at the same view of him separately and independently. And that's a historical novelist and an academic historian, which I find amazing. So it just shows that symbiosis. And similarly, as you say, it's all on a bit of a spectrum. I mean, I find that because I write everything from really niche academic history, journal articles, through to fiction. And in a sense, I find that the popular or history that I'm writing now, narrative history, almost has more in common with it has bits of both. I have to try and amalgamate both skills in it, but it's almost more similar to the fiction in terms of the importance, as you say, Paul, of storytelling. Whereas in academic prose, you're making arguments, you're making points. It's very niche and fiddly. It's very, very different. And the number of academics, as you say, Paul, who can't write and don't have a sense of the dramatic within their own field is always astonishing, isn't it?
And have no desire to write, it seems to me, as well.
Yeah, one thing you shouldn't forget with fiction, particularly successful modern historical fiction is that the characters in it tend to be relatable to very modern audiences and often possess modern sensibilities. So that this, in a way, makes them more false, because it's very rare that you come along across a book that really does render, say, how somebody would genuinely think in the medieval times, or in think about things like the torture of animals, or one's behavior towards women. You know, that what we find with Robert, although Robert's writing about 20th century by and large, tends to be a very, very 21st century person's thought, which makes it popular, because we all want to read something that we find relatable. It's much more difficult psychologically to get your head round a hero who doesn't mind the fact that, you know, women around him are being subjugated, or that a bear is being baited in front of him. You know, that's a hard thing. And I think maybe that's the real challenge for historical fiction writers who want to genuinely enter the past, is that inevitably it makes it much harder for the modern reader, particularly kind of when you have these kind of ludicrous gatekeepers who insist that everything has to be precisely acceptable to some kind of coda of 21st century politics.
No, I
Right.
agree
Well,
with that.
can I dive in here, because that last point is very interesting to me, as we've got two fiction authors here, and you talk about gatekeepers. I mean, are we really talking about sort of sensitivity readers and things like this?
Yeah.
Have you both had experience of a sensitivity reader?
I'll give you my little last one, which was, I wrote a book called Widowland a few books ago, and it had some Nazis in it, and the American edition had sensitivity readers, and they rang up and they said, well, we have found some problems. And I said, oh, what? And they said, well, we found some instances where negative personality characteristics are correlated with bodily size. I said, what? And they said, we found 3 fat Nazis. Can you make 2 of them thin? And this was incredible to me, incredible. But it's like that.
Yeah, that's what worries me. Is that I think you're absolutely right, Jane, in terms of that anachronism of characters in some historical fiction. But one of the things that I think readers do relish is the strangeness of the past when it's presented to them. And so I think of this as there's 2 novels. Well, actually, there's more than 2 novels. There's Robert Graves's Claudius novels, which were, of course, adapted with considerable relish. Whether you could do it now, I don't know. Although things like Games of Thrones deal with this. I mean, you know, which is quite risque, which is quite bold. But I think in terms of historical fiction, Graves is quite interesting because he also does the same in a much less well-known novel, which is about Milton's relationship with his wife, which is again, I think, inhabits really, really well that mindset and relishes what we might think of the perversity of the past. And actually, if you can, there are a few historical novelists who make a virtue of that relish, but I suspect that kind of viewpoint is now endangered by exactly the thing that you've just talked about, which is sensitivity readers and a general lack of courage among editors and publishers.
Well, I think it's a balancing act, isn't it, Jane? I agree with you. It's one of the central kind of balancing acts or acts of alchemy in writing historical fiction, is exactly that, is creating these characters who are relatable enough, or at least someone who can be a guide or a window or a way into a period, but also allowing them to retain some, some of the ideas and the mental landscape that they would have had. And similarly, we have to balance this with language, don't we? It's obviously less of a problem if you're writing about the 20th century, but certainly writing for me about the 17th century. Again, it's a balancing act where you don't want to have you have to modernize speech in to a degree in order to make it intelligible and pacey and read along well. But similarly, you want to have some of the sense of the language and the I very much tried with the metaphors people use, the analogies, the images they use, to try and use images or ideas that would have been part of the mental landscape in the 17th century and that aren't modern. But that's, there's no science to that, is there? It's just feel, isn't it? And instinct.
Yeah.
I think all, in a very kind of broad sweeping way, all art is an attempt to escape our existing mindset and to enter in the mindset of another, or at least share in it. And so it's a kind of, it's an ongoing struggle. But the trouble, as Miranda says, if you write a 17th century novel in 17th century language, then you're not going to get any readers. So
But there's an element that I think we're really all touching on there, is that I've been rereading for probably about the 15th time a Sharp novel from Bernard Cornwell, who's sort of legend of fiction, historical fiction, and he does it very well. But there are characters within, particularly I think his Anglo-Saxon novels, where you get lots is exaggerating, but you get a number of characters who are pretty much atheists. And I wonder, and he gets away with it because he's so good at it, I think. But there is a risk of our current thinking of becoming so overpowering that, you find characters who are basically would do very well in 2024. Would they do so well in, I don't know, 833? And I wondered, the risk is that you'll have authors trying to make almost a political point by doing this. Now, I know, I'm in the presence of two authors who don't go down this road at all, but there is an increasing amount of fiction like this. Do you find, Jane?
Like what, with very, very modern characters, you mean?
Yeah, very modern characters. I find these particularly with a novel set in the ancient world.
The great problem is that they don't, it is really, publishing's a commercial business and they want to sell books. And what readers very often are attracted by is relatability. And if they can't see themselves and relate to it, then they very often don't persevere. So the hard thing is to balance those two demands. It's really hard, and I feel we're going in the wrong direction, in that people really, really want just very modern style, relatable novels about things and places that they can see themselves in, sort of thing. It's a tough one, really.
It's very difficult to deal with religion, and until you get to the 20th century and beyond the West, it still really matters a great deal, as we realize. If people don't have that kind of religious understanding as people used to have, almost like mother's milk, then it becomes a problem to get into that mentality. It's really, really difficult, because the vast majority of the world today, and the vast majority of people who've ever lived, is religious. We're the strange ones.
We've lost that in a generation,
in that sense. I mean, and it's happened very suddenly in the West, or in parts of the West. And yet historically and even contemporarily, we are the strange ones. And I think we should have some kind of humility towards that as well. And it's very difficult to explain the past, as it is indeed very, very difficult to explain much of the modern world without an understanding of religion.
And I think that point about being brave in how you present your characters is a really interesting one. What you just said about Bernard Cornwell as well, Ollie, I noticed the same, for instance, in CJ Sanson's Shardlake series, which is wildly successful and I absolutely love. But Shardlake in that is really, empathetic, and he's actually quite squeamish. He doesn't like public executions and that kind of thing. And again, I sort of wonder, well, would we all love Shardlake if Shardlake was in the front row going, oh yes, I love a public execution. But the point about, I think this is particularly difficult when you're writing female characters. Don't know if you find this as well, Jane, but particularly going further back in the past, as I do, because you really want to give them agency. You want to give them more agency than they probably had at the time, in order for them to be your lead characters and to drive along the plot. And, that's really hard to try and do that sensitively and without making it too anachronistic. But I really didn't want to write books where all the important things happen off stage with men, and that the women sit around eating and drinking and men just bring them news. You really want your women to be doing things. But I think also it is good to be brave, though. I mean, in my two novels, for instance, I probably, my first one, I think I tried to make the heroine more relatable and a bit more modern seeming. She was quite feisty. And I think some people who read it sort of thought maybe she was on the edge of being a little bit too anachronistic. Certainly I was pushing it in that direction. And then in my second novel, I definitely pulled it back a bit, and I decided I was going to write actually slightly unlikable heroine who was very, very religious. And, you know, I just had to say that's who she was. I'm just going to own it. I'm going to try and do it, and, you know, not lay it on with a trowel. But again, I think actually people liked her more, possibly. So I think it's good to challenge yourself and to be brave about these decisions.
Yeah. And I think also there is, going back to the idea of relish, there are historical novelists who've gone exactly the other way and have not cared about modern pieties. And I suppose the supreme example of that, who was both critically and commercially hugely successful, was George MacDonald Fraser with the Flashman books, which I think, and I wouldn't be alone in saying this because I've seen the most unlikely people say this, that if you really want a sense of what the British Empire was at its height in the Victorian period, there are worse introductions and there are fewer, more entertaining introductions than George MacDonald Fraser's Flashman novels.
I mean, maybe it just comes out. One of the issues that I think people should think about is what do we call historical? I think the Historical Writers Association says the last 70 years, something's got to be 70 years old in order to be a historical period. But actually, Moore's law and everything, the time is speeding up so much that, frankly, I think historical. One of my children, I'm afraid to say, didn't know what Sinn Féin was, and this kind of, this is stuff that seems so obvious to us in our kind of 20s and 30s is literally the olden days. So actually, maybe our interpretation of historical is outdated itself.
That's probably why we need to call it fiction.
Indeed. So look, we're running out of time. Before you go, we've mentioned, I'm going to put you all on the spot. We've mentioned C.J. Sansom, Bernard Cornwell, and there is one actor who links the two, which is Sean Bean, who I absolutely adore. So this is why I'm hijacking this question here, really. And so he would be my favorite actor as a historical character through Sharp, and he's playing Thomas Cromwell at the moment on the TV series. A rather menacing Thomas Cromwell. I wondered, Jane, if I start with you, could you name an actor who you think really embodies the past particularly well?
Well, I think, also in the Cromwell era, I think Mark Rylance is incredibly good in that Wolf Hall TV series. He's got that, I mean, he literally is a Holbein portrait, isn't he? And he's got that slightly dead calculating look behind the eyes, and the coldness that you imagine an apparatchik of the Tudor court would have. So I think Mark Rylance is very good, yes.
Keeping the Cromwellian theme, actually, I would say I particularly love Ben Miles' Thomas Cromwell that he did on the stage for the RSC for the Hilary Mantel adaptations. I preferred him actually over Mark Rylance. They both have, Mark Rylance's Thomas Cromwell was all about stillness, wasn't it, and listening and a quiet voice and all that. But Ben Miles had such physical presence and such sort of energy. He just radiated energy and charisma, which even when he was standing still, he was always the person on the stage who drew the eye just because of his sort of force field around him, which I thought Thomas Cromwell probably was like. And I should also mention, I think Richard Harris as Oliver Cromwell in the Cromwell film. It's one of Paul and my favourite films about the 17th century for all its inaccuracies. But he is a wonderfully, it's a wonderful kind of whole body performance, isn't it? With the rhetoric and the glowering. It's just wonderful.
Splendid. So two men, or three if you include Sean, of course. So no pressure, Paul.
Well, funnily enough, I was going to say, I mean, I agree with, I think the greatest performance in the Cromwell film is actually Alec Guinness as Charles I. I mean, I think he really is exactly as imagined Charles I to be, even with his fey Edinburgh accent. But one of the people who one of the things about historical fiction, particularly on television, is it brings people into the idea of history, and it's one of those gateways into it. And one of mine was watching Glenda Jackson as Elizabeth. And I mean, she was one of the first actors I ever saw on television who kind of made an impression. And then years and years later, I saw her in another great work, in the flesh this time, in historical fiction, which is King Lear, when she played King Lear at the Donmar. And by then, she was no longer this all-powerful figure she was as Elizabeth I. She was this very frail figure collapsing into madness, as Lear does, but entirely convincing, and one of the greatest Lears I've ever seen. And in fact, the only other person who I'd compare being that good as Lear that I'd seen in the flesh is Derek Jacobi, who, of course, was in I, Claudius TV series, although he was, I think, fair enough, outacted by John Hurt, who was another great actor of historical figures as well, going back to A Man for All Seasons, when he's Richard Rich, of course. So, yeah, I mean, there's lots of people, I think, there who can embody those figures and have done.
And Sian Phillips as Livia as well in I, Claudius is just so menacing, isn't she?
Great stuff. Well, this has been fantastic. Thank you very much. So the event this was just a taster. It's going to get a lot more entertaining with Paul chairing, and it'll be Elizabeth Buchan, who sadly couldn't make it today. She's got her new novel out, Bonjour Sophie, which has been getting very good reviews. Jane, Thynne, thank you. Your new novel, Midnight in Vienna, out in 5th of September.
Whoa, I'm going to hold it up there.
Oh,
It's out from Quercus on September the 5th.
You weren't tempted to call it Good Night Vienna, were you?
I think that one's been taken. So.
And Miranda, Puritan Princess, and the Rebel Daughter, I think you were referring to. And when can we expect your Thomas Cromwell? Oh, not Thomas Cromwell, Cromwell book.
It's all of them.
Yes, it is. It's going to be called The House of Cromwell, and it'll be about the whole Cromwell family, linking Thomas Cromwell and the Reformation right through to Oliver Cromwell and also his family and his descendants. It's a whole sort of dynastic book. I'm halfway through it now, Ollie, so I'm delivering it next year. So I'm guessing it will be out in 2026. But you can read my novels in the meantime.
Indeed. And Paul's Providence Lost is out as well. So thank you very much and have a wonderful time at the Buckingham History Festival. I wish I could be there.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ollie.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. That's very good. Thank you.
Thanks so much for listening. Links are in the show notes, including the Buckingham History Festival. It's a great pleasure to have you join. Plenty more history to come, so please do subscribe, follow. But until then, thank you and good night.